じゃあ、いいですか？カウントダウン始めていきますよ。はい、じゃあ始めます。じゃあ10秒前。もらおうか。一応、形だけね。はい。ありがとう。
You want to bang the gable there?
いきます。
Good morning, everyone. My name is David McNeil. I am the co-chair of the FCCJ Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan PAC Committee, and I'm sitting here with my fellow co-chair, Teddy Jimbo. We are hosting what is essentially an experiment, I guess. This is our first attempt to host a lockdown online press conference. So bear with us through technical glitches and so on, which we may have to endure. We do this through Zoom. We are trying to work through some technical issues might allow you to send live questions, but for the time being, at least, we have had to accept questions in advance. So we're going to plow through those. Our speaker today, many of you, of course, will know him. He has become quite a familiar face since the COVID-19 outbreak began. He is Professor Kentaro Iwata, Professor of Infectious Diseases at Kobe University Graduate School of Medicine. Just let me read the intro here that we have briefed for you. Though it initially avoided the exponential rise in COVID-19 infections seen in other countries, Japan is hardly out of the woods yet. The number of cases has risen since mid-March, particularly in Tokyo, the center of the outbreak. The country's tally of COVID-19 infections is still a fraction of the totals seen in America and parts of Europe, but experts fear that Tokyo is teeming with unwitting hosts. Yet, many people still commute to work and many businesses remain open. Is Japan doing enough? Has the government got it right? The government is insisting that it cannot and will not order the more draconian measures that we have seen in other parts of the world. So what we are going to do obviously is try to ask Iwata Sensei about where we are with the COVID-19 outbreak, what Japan might be getting right, what it might be getting wrong possibly, or where there's room for improvement. He, of course, was the doctor who got on board the Diamond Princess and exposed very serious quarantine irregularities on that boat. That's where at least he came into public view, as far as I'm aware. So we're going to hand over to Professor Iwata. He's going to give us a briefing just on where we stand at the moment, and then we'll move straight to questions. Just before we start, sorry, Professor Iwata, if anybody wants to send a live question, I'll read out my email address, and you can send, but do wait to hear the questions first if you can. My email address is David, D-A-V-I-D, A for Apple, McNeil, M for Monday, C for Cat, N-E-I-L-L, @gmail.com. If you want to send me a question, I can read it out. That's the best we can do at the moment. Professor Iwata, お願いします。
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me. Also, I would like to thank everybody who participated in this press conference among the very busy days. As you know, everybody on Earth is seriously involved in this COVID-19 problem, and no single person on Earth is detached from this problem. So everybody should know what this problem is and how to avoid further infection to be spread. So I'd like to express my sincere desire and the opinion how to prevent this disaster to further spread both inside Japan and also outside. Also, you might have noticed that there are lots of nosocomial infections occurring in Japan. Nosocomial being the infections inside the hospital, particularly among healthcare workers such as nurses and doctors, and also the patients who did not initially have COVID-19, then catch the virus inside the hospital. And this is a serious problem. However, the containment of the spread of the virus inside the hospital is extremely important now, because even though we do have the adequate control measures and the lots of guidelines and textbook procedures available, we can't do it because of the lack of the equipment necessary for the prevention, such as masks and gowns and the healthcare workers. We lack everything. And we are forced to improvise a lot of interim guidance, which has never been proven to be effective, but had to invent them just to continue the healthcare and maintain the healthcare, so that a lot of people admitted to the hospitals with COVID-19 get adequate care. While we were forced to end up with inadequate equipment and a lot of problems, lack of resources, nosocomial infections is somewhat inevitable. And we are really in a dilemma how to face with these serious problems. Also, I'm aware that a lot of people inside the hospitals and also in the community, people's minds are also affected by this serious problem too. I'm aware that a lot of people became very angry, upset, irritated, depressed, and hostile to others, and likely to criticize persons and pointing at the fingers to people who are easy to be criticized. I don't think that's the appropriate attitude right now, because we need to face with the virus infection problem, not the human or society problem. So we shouldn't be mistaken in to whom you are fighting against. We are fighting against a viral illness. We are not fighting against hospital workers. We are not fighting against government officials. We are not fighting against the politicians, and we are not fighting against the medias. We are fighting against this pandemic. We have to, again, recognize that who should we fight against and who should we fight for. And we are fighting for the people, particularly the sick people. And this is my initial message, and I would like to welcome your questions and opinions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the obvious question, I suppose, and one that has been posed by other people that comes from your testimonial is, why are we short of masks and other equipment, and medical workers in particular? I suppose the question could be asked, we've had this virus in our sights here in Japan for over 2 months. Do you think that the government could have done more in those 2 months to prepare the kind of facilities and the kind of equipment that you're talking about?
Well, this is a universal problem all over the world, not just a problem in Japan only. For example, like a N95 mask, which is very important in protecting inside the hospital. The shortage of N95 is everywhere in the United States, European countries, and other nations. So it's just a tremendous needs happened everywhere in the world all of a sudden, and you can't have a adequate logistic solution, because if you have a logistic solution problems in general, then what you do is dispatch the equipment or items to those who are needed. But now these equipment are necessary everywhere. So you can't really focus on where to send, because it's needed everywhere. So it's a manufacturer problem. So you have to convert all the industry into the producing the medical equipment. And I'm not an industry expert, but I'm informed that it takes many months or even a year to convert the non-medical industry into a medical industry. So it is just a global problem, not just in Japan. So it is seriously inevitable that the Japanese hospitals do lack a lot of necessary equipment. And I'm not sure whether the government could do even better for this global shortage of the equipment.
Right. The New York Times is running with a piece currently which says that Japan is guilty of magical thinking. In other words, that it thought that it had a way out of this crisis, but it looks like the crisis is going to come anyway. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's unfair?
I'm not sure. Well, what I could say is that Japan was very lucky to be very successful in Plan A, which is the cluster chasing and the cluster containment strategy, with the minimum PCR tests comparing to the other nations. And the tests were focused on those who are at the risk. And I think it was very wise and very effective measures up until when it became not very effective, particularly in Tokyo and Osaka area. We needed to prepare for the worst situation when the cluster chasing became not effective. And we needed to change the strategy immediately, responding to the situation change. But traditionally speaking, and historically speaking, Japan is not very good at changing the strategy. When we begin one strategy, so-called Plan A, we are very poor at converting it to Plan B, and we are very poor at even thinking of Plan B, because thinking of Plan B is a sign of admitting a failure of Plan A. And a lot of people who are in charge of this infection control, particularly the bureaucrats, are very, they dislike admitting the possibility of failure of the plan, because they have to complete the plan as they planned initially. So that's the shortcomings of the Japan's strategy, and that probably caused a significant delay in initiating the change of the strategy, which is happening now in Tokyo and other areas, i.e. Increasing the number of the tests, increasing the capability of the healthcare societies, and the room for the hotels and other facilities to accept asymptomatic or mild symptom patients. And these were the things we claimed are necessary since February, but didn't happen for months. So that's the problem we are facing with. I'm not sure we are believing in the magics in these problems, but we could have thought that the Plan A was successful in ending this epidemic, which probably wouldn't happen.
Thank you. Well, just in terms of successes, Tokyo has just passed 3,000 infections, I believe.
Yes.
But it took a long time to reach that figure. I think it took a week even to get to 1,000 infections. And we still don't see anything like the explosion that we've seen in the UK or America. And also, a sort of slightly positive note, the infection rate seems to be decelerating, at least according to the latest figures. Are you encouraged by that?
I'm half encouraged and I'm half discouraged by the figures we are seeing right now. I'm relieved to see the figures of the newly infected people reported daily was relatively stable. And my biggest fear was the explosion of the diagnosis of thousands or even more daily infections occurred like in New York City, which didn't happen. Despite the fact that still the number of the PCR tests in Tokyo might be under the adequate numbers, But still, I say that these numbers are much better than the worst case scenario. So I think the control measure in Tokyo is relatively working, but it's not working to the extent that for example, Professor Nishura wanted, which is the decline of the newly diagnosed cases significantly to stop the outbreak so that we can stop this state of emergency by May 6th as scheduled. So this is a half good and half bad situation, I would say.
Thank you. We have a question here from Ilgin Yorumals of BBC World Turkish. If the modeling of this disease in Japan is to be believed, as many as 40,000 outpatients and 20,000 inpatients a day are expected. She doesn't say where she got those figures, but she does say, is that model correct?
I don't know. I haven't seen that model myself, so I can't really comment on that.
Right. You don't think those figures are credible, or they seem very high?
Before commenting on that, I need to see the detail on how these numbers are based on.
All right. A question from Rocky Swift of Reuters. A potential vaccine will not be here for 12 to 18 months, and barring that, it will take 2 to 3 years for the population to develop herd immunity to the virus. That's according to one scientist he has talked to. What's your view on how this will likely play out? So he's asking about the vaccine and the herd immunity issue.
Yes, herd immunity issue has several problems, I think. Vaccine could be developed in 1 year or 2 years, and it could be delivered, as pointed out, like within 3 years or so. But this is only if that vaccine was proven to be safe and effective. And through the history, many vaccines were tried, and many of them were unsuccessful. Some of the vaccines were too risky for providing to the people, and some vaccines were not very effective as expected. So it depends on the clinical trial results to demonstrate the efficacy and safety of the vaccines. I'm aware that many vaccines are now tried from several companies. So I hope one of these be very successful, but I can't really be that optimistic to conclude that the vaccine will be available by this time or that time yet, as of now. Herd immunity. So a lot of misunderstanding regarding the development of antibody and the development of herd immunity. So we know that the antibody will be produced after this coronavirus infection, at least for many people. But the development of antibody inside your body is not necessarily development of immunity against this disease. For example, HIV infection, the cause of AIDS, the antibody will be produced, but it will not eradicate the virus in your body. So again, production of antibody does not warrant the development of immunity. And we don't know much about this coronavirus infection yet. We know that there might be some reinfection of coronavirus infection who got the infections previously. So the immunity probably would not be that perfect, unlike measles infection, for example, where the measles, once you get the measles, then you will never get the measles again. But that might not happen in coronavirus infection. So a lot of unknowns and unclearness, uncertainties exist in this development of antibody and development of individual immunity, hence the herd immunity as a population. So again, I'm half optimistic and half pessimistic in waiting for the herd immunity theory. Could work, but might not. So you have to be prepared for both scenarios, good and bad.
Thank you. We have a question from Simon Denyer of the Washington Post newspaper. Even at this stage, deaths in Japan compared to total population remains extremely low.
Yes.
He quotes 224 deaths compared to thousands in Western Europe. Mm-hmm. Why is this? Are people undiagnosed who actually have COVID-19, or is there a medical reason for the low death rate?
Well, I could think of several reasons as a theory, but I don't have any as proven fact yet. First of all, the number of the people who got diagnosed as COVID-19 in Japan are relatively low still. It's not that high as many European nations and United States and the other nations which suffered from this disease. So if the denominator is low, then the number of the deaths will be low. So it's very obvious. Well, you might say that there are lots of underdiagnosed people behind who are not tested but still had the infections. And this is not just Japan, but recent American study suggested about 50 to 80 times positive antibody test result comparing to the PCR test result in west coast of America. So many nations do have undiagnosed patients. So the real number of the infections we don't still know, but still we could have relatively lower number of the infected people, hence the lower number of the death. That's one theory. It is possible that the undiagnosed deaths from some pneumonia and those people who never got tested for coronavirus infection, does it exist in Japan? It could. But how many? I don't know. And so if you look into that theory too much, that will easily become a conspiracy theory, which we should not take unless you have a clear evidence or data. We don't see anybody who die of unknown illness in your apartment on the street, and this is not happening. Japan has a system that most people who died will be detected, and I don't think the community has a lot of deaths unfound. So most people who die would die in the hospitals, and most hospitals will test for COVID-19 if you have a unknown diagnosis and death, particularly from pneumonia. So I would say that there might be some individual cases with undiagnosed COVID-19 infections with death, but at this point, after observing several hospitals surrounding me, I don't think that is happening everywhere. So the number of the accuracy of the deaths is relatively believable, I would say. And then next question would be why. A lot of theories exist, such as injection of BCG in childhood, some sort of genetic factors among Asians, because a lot of successful nations are from Asia, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong. So these could be factors, but these are all the theories never been scrutinized or proven. So I would again say these are all the theories, but not really proven facts.
Thank you. One of the theories floating around the always reliable internet is that Japan's stringent anti-flu measures. So the fact that elderly people in particular take quite elaborate measures sometimes to stay free of the flu in the winter. You think that might be having an impact? That's one of the theories that we've read.
That I don't know. Because the single most effective measure to fight against the flu is vaccinations. So the vaccination availability is relatively okay for elderly people in Japan, but that would not protect against the COVID-19. So I don't know whether that would lead to the low rate of infections against coronavirus infections.
Thank you. Back to Rocky Swift's question. He had a two-part question. The second part is, so we were talking, if you recall, about the potential vaccine and the herd immunity. Under either of these scenarios, what's the likelihood that the Olympics could go ahead next year, do you think?
To be honest with you, I don't think Olympic is likely to be held next year, if held any time. Again, I think I told told one of you a couple months ago that holding Olympics needs two conditions. One, controlling a COVID-19 in Japan, and controlling a COVID-19 everywhere, because you have to invite the athletes and the audience from all over the world. Unlike other sports events where 40, 50, 60 nations gather, Olympic Games are from hundreds of nations, and you have to invite so many athletes from many, many places, which is not very compatible with these COVID-19 infections, which is causing a pandemic. Japan might be able to control this disease by next summer, and I wish we could, but I don't think that would happen everywhere on Earth. So in this regard, I'm very pessimistic about holding Olympic Games in next summer, unless you hold Olympic Games in a totally different structures, such as no audience or very limited participations or such and such.
Thank you. We've had several questions since we have gone live on this particular issue. I'll read one. This is from Richard Lloyd Parry of the Times newspaper from the UK. What is your view of the suggestion that the virus originated in a laboratory leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? As you know, that's a very common conspiracy theory which is making the rounds now, particularly in America. And it may even become an election issue this year. Would you care to comment on that?
I'm not an expert of the conspiracy theory, and I'm not an expert on the weapon development. I've never developed any weapons myself, so I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that is likely, though. It is most likely a spontaneous occurrence of the transmission from one animal or several animals to the humans and engender this pandemic. I don't see any clear evidence of suggesting that this virus was made in China or United States or any other nations as a weapon, unless you see the beta theories. Of course, many microbes could be made by humans. The typical example being the anthrax bacteria, which was spread intentionally in 2001 in the United States. Contained in the envelope and the genetically engineered to be likely to be spread easily to humans, and that was developed at laboratory. We don't know which laboratory still, but so there's a history. But for this coronavirus, we don't have any evidence of suggesting that. I have never seen any document or data to suggest this. So at this point, I don't think we should believe in this kind of theories.
Thank you. Well, if it is a biological weapon, it's a very ineffective one because it's just torpedoed the Chinese economy.
Yeah.
This is a question from Anthony Rowley of the South China Morning Post. Is it possible that the virus will mutate spontaneously to become less or possibly more dangerous to humans?
It is possible. And if so, it is more likely to be less contagious than become more contagious. Well, we do have many viral infections we had to fight against. And history tells us that the very few viral disease changed dramatically by mutation to affect human being totally differently. Very few cases. Typical example being the influenza. Influenza causes a lot of mutations, and sometimes it causes the change of the antigen structure called antigenic shift, and which would evade the immunity of a human being and causes pandemics every several decades. So this happens. So we can't guarantee this doesn't happen in coronavirus infection, but the antigenic shift in influenza virus tells us that this does not occur very frequently For influenza, it happens every several decades, and for many viral infections such as HIV, hepatitis virus, measles, rubella, many viral diseases does not change significantly. If mutation occurs, they don't cause a significant change in the characteristics of the diseases. So the likelihood is that it probably would not happen.
Thank you. This is a question from Katrin Erdmann of ARD German Radio. What do you think about Avigan, the drug, of course, and the fact that Japan is offering this to other countries? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's always good to have a lot of candidates as a treatment measures. So I always welcome the new candidates occurs. As far as I know, there are more than 200 clinical trials ongoing for coronavirus infections from a variety of countries and testing many treatments. So the Avigan is one of the candidates which could be useful, and we should test for the effect of that for sure. And what we know about Avigan is it may work against COVID-19 infections. We do have a very indirect evidence of effective of this drug, but we don't have any comparative clinical data to conclude that this is a good drug to use. So, but still, we can prepare and we can dispatch and we can try this drug among other measures and see how much effectiveness this drug has. So I'm not go forward against this drug at all.
Thanks again. The next question is from Sonja Blaschk. She works for Arte Zeitung. It's a German medical newspaper. And she wants to know about the recent controversy between President Donald Trump in the States and the WHO. So her question is, recently President Trump decided to withdraw funding from the WHO. From your point of view, where do you see potential for improvement in the WHO, in the organization?
In general, I don't want to make any political comments for any reasons. But I need to say that the WHO needs to be supported now. WHO needs a lot of support from a variety of bodies. So this is not a good time to cut down the support, financial support or any other to WHO, which is probably counterproductive against COVID-19 management. And it will not benefit the United States either. So I don't think it's a good idea to be hostile against any international bodies from one nation at this time. I'm not particularly pointing at a finger at President Trump, but anybody. We need a cooperation, but we shouldn't penalize any international bodies at this point. It's not a very wise idea, despite. I don't know whether these claims by the United States, whether China was not adequately behaving with WHO or vice versa. I don't know whether that was fact or not. But regardless, this is not the time to go against any international bodies from any nation.
Thank you. So it's not the time to pick a fight. The next question is from Rupert Wingfield-Hayes of the BBC. He wants to know if you can comment on the hospital situation in Tokyo. I know you've already commented a little bit, but if you could just elaborate, I'll read his question. Why are we seeing people being rejected by dozens of hospitals? We have seen stories online of people being rejected, and actually on NHK of up to 80 hospitals circulating in ambulances trying to find some place to go, and spending hours and hours in ambulances searching for a hospital. Is it because capacity is running out? Is it because there's no pandemic plan for assigning infectious ward beds? Is it because Japan's hybrid health system, its public-private health system, is not able to cope? Would you be able to comment on that? And the sort of related question, and we've had several of this, is shouldn't Japan's government have seen all this coming earlier? Shouldn't they have had a plan in place? As you said, they had a plan A. They don't seem to have had a plan B.
Well, and let me begin with your last question, that Japan's government should have started the change of the strategy earlier, as I stated before, for sure. There was a tremendous delay in dealing with this problem, so that caused huge problems at healthcare. Since I don't reside in Tokyo, so I don't know the detail about the situation in Tokyo, but a lot of friends of mine work in hospitals in Tokyo. So according to their information, what I could estimate is that the many hospitals in Japan, not just in Tokyo, are not ready to fight against COVID-19. This is the tendency Japan's hospitals did have. It's against Ebola virus infections. It's against HIV/AIDS. Many infectious diseases had designated hospitals, and COVID-19 likewise. So this engenders the tendency that many other general hospitals could forget about the one particular infectious diseases, because they do have a designated hospital, so they can be the one to deal with, so we don't have to deal with this. And that caused the lack of preparedness and the lack of the willingness to see the cases and patients. So a lot of hospitals and healthcare workers in many hospitals do hate to deal with this problem because they have a designated hospitals they can rely on. Since this became the pandemic and the designated hospitals no longer could contain the disease by themselves, every hospitals need a cooperation and need a participation to fight against COVID-19. But the transition probably didn't occur smoothly. And that causes probably a lot of rejections of potential infections because the hospitals are not prepared for remember my initial statement that the nosocomial infections are a serious issue, and you need to have an adequate preparation and training. If you don't have preparedness and training, you can't just allow patients coming into the hospitals. That causes further damages to the hospitals. So many hospitals probably didn't have that preparedness and trainings, and they reject the patients or potential patients coming in. So the ambulance has to go to another and another and another. But designated hospitals were completely filled in, particularly in ICU, by COVID-19. So they don't have any room to admit newly diagnosed patients. So this is a serious problem. So that probably have caused huge problems in many places, including the Kobe, Hyogo, where I live, and Osaka, and Tokyo, and several other places. It's a serious problem, but I don't know whether this will be solved instantly, because this is more like a structural problems and cannot be solved in one night.
So it's a bureaucratic, long-standing bureaucratic issue, not a conspiracy, as some people have said, of course, yeah?
Oh, I don't think it's a conspiracy at all.
Well, you probably already answered this question, but I'll read it out anyway. It is related. This is from Dennis Normile of Science magazine. Can you explain Japan's policy during the Plan A phase, and what was the rationale for that policy? Of course, you've already said that part of it was to snuff out clusters, wasn't it? And yes, to isolate the clusters.
Yes.
We still hear many anecdotes of people having difficulty getting tested. This is a long-standing issue in Japan, as you know. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, Japan's initial strategy was to not to test asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic patients. And Japan's government wanted them to stay home so that they don't cause further transmissions of the disease. And only those who have persistent infections or severe cases or patients with risk factors need tested. So it's a more restricted test policy. But relatively speaking, every nation has that policy. UK, US, European nations, every nations do have the test policy. So most of the nations don't select the random testings. So it's a more relative things, but Japan had a more strict measures to select out the people who need to test it. And they wanted to find the clusters. And once they find the clusters, they chase the close contacts and test the close contact and isolate the close contact. Japan has a public health system called Hokenjo, which is very effective in containing and tracing these close contacts with the strategy against the tuberculosis. So these measures against the tuberculosis probably worked very well in the beginning of the epidemic when the number of the patients were relatively low. But if number became bigger and bigger, then Hokenjo no longer could handle these numbers, and they got tired and they got incapacitated. Then it became ineffective. So that was mainly the initial strategy Japan's government had. And as I told you, this worked very well in the beginning.
Thank you. And a related question again this is from Justin McCurry of The Guardian newspaper in the UK. South Korea has reported just 8 new cases on Sunday. Yeah. Why hasn't the Japanese government given more serious thought to a Korean-style approach of containing the virus, i.e. that is widespread testing and tracing? Presumably you've already answered that question.
Yes. So as I told you, Japan was not really bad at handling a disease in the beginning of the epidemic. At the same time, South Korea had a much more number of patients, began with some religious group meetings. If the number of the patients were much bigger, such as thousands of patients, then you need more tests. So the test is a consequence of the situation, not the vice versa. So the situation decides how many tests you needed. Because Japan didn't have a lot of patients, at the same time, South Korea was seriously suffering from the disease. Japan didn't need that test. So the difference between South Korea and Japan at that time was the difference in the situations, not the test strategy, in my opinion. So it is pointless to compare the South Korea and Japan at that time, which was better. I think both did very well. Now the situation has been changing in Japan. So we are getting out of control with many more patients occurring in many places in Japan. So Japan needs a change of the strategy, as I said, and needs a relatively more close to South Korean approach, i.e. More PCR testing and the finding and detecting more patients. But this shift is not happening immediately. So there was some delay in the change of the strategy. And that is causing a problem right now.
Thank you. Teddy, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a little bit of a follow-up on that one. Dr. Iwata, yes. Do you think the current emergency measures that Japan is taking right now, do you think it's sufficient? Do you think it's working to contain the COVID-19? And if it's not, what do we need to expect coming next?
Well, the answer is no. I don't think Japan is handling the disease right now adequately. You might have known that through the many interviews I have had, that I'm not for or against Japan's government at all. And I don't have a political view on this issue at all. So I'm not a friend or enemy of Japan's government. I just say that this measure was good and this measure was bad from the scientific point of view, purely scientific. Now, stating that, as I told you, currently the Japan's government was so slow and so late in coping with the change of the situation, which apparently is happening. And also, they haven't shared the mission among players, what to do right now. So there are lots of views among governments and politicians and bureaucrats, and they are not coherent, and there was no harmonization. So lots of bits of measures were mingled, and so that they were not able to deliver the appropriate message to the nation, which is you need a distancing to block the further transmission to occur. So the PCR testing is only one measure, but the far more important is the blocking the route of the transmission. If you block the route of the transmission, the further transmission would not occur, and the epidemic will slow down. And the most effective way of stopping the further transmission is a so-called lockdown, particularly in Tokyo area. So they should have told that this is a lockdown, effectively lockdown. And but Japan doesn't have a law to allow lockdown to force people to obey the order of the government or local government. But that doesn't matter, because you could say that you should stay home and you shouldn't go out of the town and you shouldn't come into this town. And the message could be delivered very effectively and thoroughly and continuously, even without punishment or penalize people who didn't follow or obey the order. So that lack of message could have engendered the people who sometimes go out and sometimes didn't, and kind of intermediate behaviors. So that could longer this problem. We need far more effective measures to protect the hospitals. One more thing I would like to comment on is the discharge policy and admission policy, which needs to be revised. Already, Japanese Society of Infectious Diseases and the Environmental Infection Control stated that we should change the admission and the discharge policy of the patients. Those people who got a positive test with PCR with mild symptom should stay home. And the societies did say that, and I agree with them. They shouldn't be in a hospital, and the hospitals are already suffering from many patients. Also, we do have the policies to force every patient with COVID-19 to have a 2 negative PCR test before the discharge, which needs to be changed. The American CDC changed the policy, and they don't require a 2 negative test as a prerequisite to discharge. And I would like to ask Japan's government to do the same. They said halfly that the PCR is not mandatory, but they didn't really seriously, clearly said that. And that should change. Otherwise, the hospital will have more and more patients with COVID-19, and the hospital workers will really get fatigued, and the medical system could collapse with this problem. So we need the outlet change and inlet change of the patients.
So let me just get it straight. So further, more strict and perhaps the forceful lockdown is going to be inevitable for Japan in the near future.
At least in a part of Japan.
At least Tokyo.
At least in Tokyo. So before May 6th, where this state of emergency could end, we need a further concrete message to stay home and don't go out, and keep the distance of 2 meters away if you had to go out. These messages are not very effectively delivered, and a lot of people believing in wearing a mask is a solution, which is not. And I still keep getting the questions, are you for or against the masks? And my answer is, I don't care, because mask is not very important point. That's not the point to discuss. The issue is whether you keep the distance of 2 meters away and stay home. And at first you stay home, you don't need any mask at all. But still people keep asking me that, are you go for or against mask, and which mask you should wear, and where do you buy it, or what do you think of the measures to deliver the 2 masks to every home? These are things relatively or quite trivial, not really the essential part of these measures.
Back to you, David.
Thank you. Several questions, all basically with the same theme, Dr. Iwata, on the next 12 months. I know you probably don't like looking into your crystal ball, but this one is from Martin Kohling. He's from Handelsblatt. That's the German business daily newspaper. He says, what is your scenario for Japan at the moment? Do you have any predictions for when the economy can begin again? And just sort of, as a side note or as a footnote, this one is from Simon Denyer again of the Washington Post. Surely a lockdown only buys time. Are we facing periodic lockdowns all year as the disease ebbs and flows?
Mm-hmm. Okay. In principle, I usually don't predict anything. Prediction is not my specialty. I'm a clinician, scientist. So what I would do is to develop possible scenarios and make the solutions to every potential scenarios, good scenarios and bad scenarios, and best scenario and the worst scenario. So I need to be able to deal with any kind of situations and never get surprised by anything coming. Therefore, I don't make any predictions for that. So it could linger and it could end, or it could, many European nations do see the decrease the number of the patients, such as Denmark, Italy, Spain, and Germany, Iceland. So also China and the South Korea were almost successful in ending the epidemic. So we know that this endemic could end by measures, but sometimes it is very difficult also. So I have to be prepared for both scenarios. So if the measures were very effective and the government's message were very clear and this changed the movement of the people, we think we can end this epidemic in several months, as some other nations. But if we were not, then we had to face with this disease for many months to come. Both scenarios are possible. Now, the repetition of lockdown is also a possibility, because as seen in China, even if you were successful in ending the epidemic, still you might see a lot of other infected people coming in to the city again. So the resurgence of the epidemic could occur. As I told you, this herd immunity theory is just a theory at this point. And so the reinfection could occur with those who got infected before. My thinking is lockdown is not a digital thing. So it's not a yes or no. My understanding of lockdown is more like a relative. So you have this level lockdown, then if you are successful, then you will cut down the lockdown level to this level, like what you see in Italy and Spain. You can't just stop the lockdown all of a sudden because this is too dangerous. So you go up and down of lockdowns. Even Wuhan in China did not have a complete release of lockdown yet. So they are very alert still to avoid the resurgence of infections. So rather saying the repetition of lockdown, I would say the lockdown would be relatively continued on this level, then to be lowered to this level. So our society needs to be in some sort of lockdown for a long, long time, many even for years, but with the decreased or increased level depending on the situation.
Thank you. Well, we've got about 6 minutes left and a lot of questions. I'll try to prioritize. This one is from Andy Sharp of the Nikkei Business. He says, how meaningful are Japan's statistics on the number of infections? Can they be relied on? Are you happy with the figures?
I'm not unhappy with the figures, but as I told you, the Japan's government didn't try to count every infection to begin with. They wanted mild cases to stay home, which means they don't want to count mild cases to begin with. So you don't have to consider the official figure as the precise number of infected. But that number would suggest the trend of the infection going up and down at every prefecture. So you can consider this number as the indicator of the trend rather than considering as the exact figure of the infected people.
Thank you. Just a note of clarification. Motoko Rich of the New York Times has been in touch. So I said that Japan, the New York Times says Japan is guilty of magical thinking. She says, no, the magical thinking is on the part of people who still go out under a state of emergency. So we do see lots of pictures online of people in bars, izakayas. I've tweeted 1 or 2 pictures of people in pachinko parlors. But I think the lockdown has become a little more stringent since then, hasn't it? Just a question from Patrick Walter. He's a German journalist. Why is it that the number of coronavirus patients being already discharged from hospitals is relatively small in Japan compared to other countries?
Well, it's obviously because of the discharge policy was so strict, and the government doesn't allow a lot of recovered people to be out of the hospital, and which is a serious problem. I think it's the Japan's myth to believe infectious disease is a microbiology. The specialty of infectious disease is not a microbiology. They are related, but they are not the same. We have to see the patients as having symptoms and having a disease, not a virus per se. So we don't have to deal with a virus, and we don't have to eradicate the virus before the discharge. We just need to cure and make the patient recover. Then the road to the hospital will be over. So this misunderstanding or the lack of the understanding of the concept of infectious diseases are making the hospital management very difficult right now in Japan.
Thank you. A related question from Mr. Welter. The shortage of ICU beds, we hear a lot about that in Tokyo. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, we know that the ICU beds, ventilators, and also the critical care specialists, the numbers are relatively lower than other developed nations in Japan. And also we need to see a lot of critically ill people other than COVID-19. So those who are not capable of seeing the COVID-19s are very busy seeing the critically ill patients because the designated hospitals are rejecting those non-COVID patients. And this is a wise idea to separate the role of the healthcare systems. But still, because of the resurgence of the sick people with COVID-19, that would suffer all ICU beds and ICU healthcare workers. And I'm very worried about those who work in ICU. And in addition, they are at danger of getting an infection themselves. So the system is on the verge of the collapse in many places in Japan.
Dr. Iwata, just to follow up, but why is it that Japan is so low with the ICU beds? I mean, compared to, you said, other developed, advanced countries, but Japan's number of ICU beds per capita or per, 10,000 people are half of that of Italy, and maybe less than almost 1/10 of Germany. While Japan is spending so much money on the on healthcare. So how come there's such a sort of discrepancy on the part of ICU in Japan? Can you just give us some background about how budget was not spent on ICU?
Well, I'm not an expert in critical care or the structure of ICU, so I can't really comment on a situation in ICU per se, but I have to tell you that Japan didn't spend much money on healthcare. Comparing to the other nations, Japan was more stringent on containing the budget for healthcare. We haven't spent much money for vaccinations. We haven't spent much money on the number of the doctors. We haven't spent much money on healthcare overall. With this very stringent budget, we had to see very, very many patients, and most doctors and nurses are very tired of the daily care and on the verge of the medical system collapse, then the COVID-19 came. So we didn't have much room to spare our effort and time to COVID-19 to begin with. And we were on a crisis, and just COVID-19 made it very apparent. So that's the reality.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. There are a lot of questions coming in, and I think that's a testimony to the huge interest in what you have to say, Dr. Iwata. Just in terms of your own health, because you did, the last time you talked at the FCCJ, you were self-isolating, if you recall.
Yes.
Presumably, you're back to 100%, are you?
Yes.
Good.
I'm back to normal life, but I still have to be prepared because you had to come into the red zones, and also the Kobe city is a red zone in a sense. So anytime you could get a COVID-19 anywhere.
Well, it's great to hear. Well, look, thank you so much, Dr. Kentaro Iwata of Kobe University, for taking an hour of your time, your very valuable time, to come and talk to us and clarify these issues. You know, there's an awful lot of misinformation out there, and I think you, again, have kind of cut through all of the misinformation and given us a really valuable press conference. For people who are listening, this was an experiment by the FCCJ. What we're trying to do is to go online. This press conference is available on Vimeo, and it will be available on the FCCJ YouTube website from tomorrow, a recorded version of that. What we're going to try and do in the coming days and weeks is to iron out the gremlins and make sure that you can, journalists that is, can be part of the press conference, can take part in it and actually ask their questions live. What we've done this time is taken questions from people via email. I think that's it. Teddy?
That's it. And one last thing is, Dr. Iwata, we're going to mail you the 1 year guest membership at the FCCJ as a sign of gratitude. So when things settle down, please come and join us here at the FCCJ in Tokyo.
Look forward to it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
ありがとうございました。